Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Jams D podcast where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we're coming at you with two new reviews for two new records. We're going to be talking about the most recent album from post-hardcore band
Screamo.
Screamo.
They're a Connecticut-based Screamo band called Foxtails.
Foxtails. They're new.
Gonna call them a fusion band, but the fusion is emo and
their new album,
Chamber Screamo.
Fawn.
That's good. I would use that. Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about the new album from Boris. We're going to be talking about W. And also, of course, this week is
Weezer.
Yep, Boris's new album, Weezer. With this week, we're joined by one of the podcast's favorite Nebraskans, Connor. What's up, bro?
How's it going?
Yeah.
I look very dark on camera. I wish I had a light.
It's okay. I'm too bright, so we can just even it out all together, man. That's what it's about, harmony and shit. And you are on here partially to discuss the records that we're going to be talking about this week. And for our record club, Morgan's record club this week, we're going to be talking about Is a Real Boy by Say Anything. So look forward to that. This week on the channel, we've recently put up a discussion between myself and podcast friend Jen. We talked about the Mike Flanagan limited mini-series last year, Midnight Mass. That's a great little discussion. Had super good time doing that. Check that out. Check out Midnight Mass if you haven't. Spoiler-laden discussion, but a fun one nonetheless. And also...
last week, I think it was last weekend actually, August released August, who obviously as regular viewers will know is taking a bit of a break from the main part of the channel, but he's still active and will be returning to us soon. But in the meantime, he delivered us a work of supreme fiction. I had a conversation with him the other day where I said that genuinely I found it profoundly moving, and
yes.
it is a let's play of the new hype internet sensation Wordle, and that's all you need to know about it. It's only 8 minutes long. Go and watch it. It is legitimately one of the most fantastic productions that has been posted to this channel in recent months. It's excellent. And also, like last week, we were joined by our friend, another friend of the podcast, April, for reviews of two quite huge new records, Earl Sweatshirt's Sick and FKA Twigs' Capri Songs. So you can go and check out those reviews if you want. That went up last Sunday. We also did a fantastic Record Club episode on one of my favorite albums of all time, one of April's favorite albums of all time, the Mammoth double album from progressive metal legends, Maudlin of the Well, Bath/Leaving Your Body Map. We had a great discussion about astral projection and crazy shit in that video. So check that out. Check that record out. Check out the Midnight Mass video as well, and plenty more to come.
Look, if you like the idea of Let's Plays, some of those might be happening in the near future with some upcoming new video game releases that people might want to pay attention to. Ooh.
All this is to say that we have been and are going to continue to be expanding the reach in terms of the types of media this channel covers, trying to broaden our audience without kind of sacrificing or letting go of any of the core content that we've been doing. Jams and Tea will still be going strong every week. And we have a lot of exciting new releases coming up in the next few weeks to review.
Oh, God, yeah.
But
debatably too many.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, shit. Before then, though, let's get into what we have been listening to for the last week. Jake, what have you been listening to?
Well, I got to kick off with what is the current and, like, in my opinion, the first 2022 album of the year, genuine contender for this title. I know Ryley's been listening to this one as well, but I got to shout out the new album from post-metal band,
atmospheric sludge metal, post-metal.
Cult of Luna, the new album, The Long Road North, which is, I mean, this is just colossal. I would describe it as partially absolutely hellish and also like an all-consuming vacuum of misery. That is to say, it's awesome and I love it. It's insanely heavy. It's like it's a combination of so many different kinds of metal without diluting any of the particular subgenres that it belongs to. And as a result, it comes in and is just this absolutely kinetic, incredibly refined, incredibly well-paced hour-long metal record that just manages to be one of the most engaging listens I've had since maybe the most recent Ulcerate album, I would say, is partially comparable to something like this. But this is even more unique. It has even more moving parts, and all of the instrumental prowess is just utterly outstanding. I mean, it's an album that is absolutely impressive on every single front, and I recommend that to everybody. I can't imagine anyone I know not enjoying it.
I will heartily co-sign. And an important caveat that should be mentioned is that this album isn't actually out yet. The implication I'm not going to make specific as to how we listen to it, but if you desire to hear it before it's released, that is possible. However, we obviously encourage you to support the band. I've also pre-ordered the album on Bandcamp as well, because this shit is fucking fantastic. Legitimately one of the best metal records that I've heard in months. It is outstanding. And when I say it's an atmospheric sludge metal / post metal record, it is definitely leaning heavier towards the more sort of intense and fast paced side of that sort of style of music. It really appeals to the teenage post-metal fan within me. Definite comparisons to bands that I love like Isis and Neurosis, but super clean, super modern production, really, really great melodic riffs, outstanding vocal performances, and really neat cameos from Colin Stetson as well. I mean, what more could you want? So we're really kind of pushing it here, even though it's not out yet, because as February is so stacked, there's a real chance we might not get a chance to formally review it. So we're going to be shouting about it from the rooftops regardless until every single person we know has heard it, because it's the real deal, folks.
And on the note of metal, I've been listening to a lot of it this week, and I gave a new listen to a band that I have no single solitary excuse for not listening to more of, considering what I have heard of them up until this point is bare minimum excellent and maximum some of the best I've heard in the genre. That being, I listened to Bathory's Under the Sign of the Black Mark, and oh man, this this is every bit as good as the absolutely superlative Bloodfire Death, which is favorite Bathory album, but that could change just because they have a lot of good albums. But if you want amazing blackened thrash metal, there's nothing better. Nothing at all. There's some of like the riffs on here that are just like, I just remember listening to this and I was just like walking back and forth at work, and then eventually there'll just be like this absolutely fucking electric riff and my spine just kind of tingled, and I was like, oh, that's hitting the right spots in my brain. It's definitely not for everybody. The production is definitely on the more extreme end of that sort of wave of metal, kind of the Dark Throne. You know, if you're expecting clean production from something like this, then go elsewhere, because you're not going to get it. This shit sounds like it was recorded in the fucking cave. But that's part of the appeal, really, is that, I mean, it just sounds like the band is playing a concert in hell. So, you know, I also listened to something that Ryan recommended that I listened to a while ago when I got into some albums from the artist Grouper. You told me to check out the single/EP release Paradise Valley.
I did.
And you told me explicitly, you were just like, it has a 3.9 on Rate Your Music. Listen to it and you'll find out why. And I guess you could say that I A, fucked around, and B, found out, because this is stellar. This is it's 2 songs, but it's 8-9 minutes long. That said, it's a gobsmackingly gorgeous EP. It is the best thing I've heard from her thus far, which I've only heard like 4-ish projects from her. So, take that with a grain of salt, but considering how much I love the other ones, this is just like the first song is excellent, but the second song is one of the best, like most overbearingly atmospheric, slowcore ambient, whatever the fuck you can technically classify her as. It's just one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. It stopped me dead in my tracks and was more than earned its incredibly high reputation. Frankly, I gave a listen last night, and I had a transcendental experience, frankly, giving a shot to an album that I've always thought was really good, that Morgan's leaning in because he fucking knows. I've been wanting to revisit this album just because initially when I listened to this, I thought it was great, but it didn't compete with the albums that are in the sort of golden run of this particular band, that being the Smashing Pumpkins album, Adore, sort of the first 4 albums they have of Gish, Melancholy, Adore, and fucking Siamese Dream. Adore was my least favorite, which I don't feel like that's a particularly controversial take, just because that tends to be the one people gravitate towards the least of those 4. And I gave it another shot, and I gotta say, it took a while to get accustomed to it, in the sense that it's a really different direction than what they were going in. There are parts of that album that sound borderline new wavy. It sounds like there's like a gothic edge to the sound. Like, I mean, there are parts of it where it sounds like Songs of Faith and Devotion era Depeche Mode. That said, it's a look that the band wears very, very well. Like, if, it might take a bit of an adjustment period to get to, but that run of songs, like the first like 9 songs on this album, just untouchable. It doesn't ever like stop or like really be anything less than like great or anything, but holy shit, this thing just does not miss. Not to mention the actual like production and engineering work on this album sounds fucking incredible. Like, just trying to imagine this being made in 1998 is insane. Like, Melancholy sounds great and all, but just going into this is just like, wow, this is like if you took the sort of sharper, more refined, definitive songwriting and sound that Melancholy gave to their sound, and the atmospherics that are present in something like Siamese Dream, and as a whole ends up being something that's like, it's like an hour and 10 minutes long. It's a long record, but it's it has the expanse of Melancholy, but it also has the density of Dream.
So on the note of the production and sound of that record, which I'm glad that you brought up, so there's 2 main sort of producers / mixers who are involved with making this record. One is Brad Wood, who has an impeccable resume in terms of 90s rock records. He produced Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville. He produced Sunny Day Real Estate's Diary, and a bunch of other excellent records and things that he's worked with. But the other producer I want to shout out, a producer you may have heard of, is a producer who goes by the name of Flood, who also helped with the mixing.
Melancholy.
Yeah, so he's obviously behind the boards on Melancholy as well, but he's also behind the boards on a few other records that I want to shout out that you can definitely hear the influence of, or at least like you can hear that they had the same sort of vision behind them. One is PJ Harvey's To Bring You My Love, which has a similar kind of gothic edge to it, I think. More relevant still is both Pretty Hate Machine and particularly The Downward Spiral by 9 Inch Nails. Flood was a huge part of the production on those records.
Pretty Hate Machine's all over Adore. That makes so much sense.
And most relevant is that you made a comparison to Songs of Faith and Devotion by Depeche Mode. That record was produced by Flood. So there you go.
I know things about music sometimes.
Yeah, and so when I listen to Adore, like one of the things that most jumps out about me and one of the things I most enjoy about that record is that sound that it has, that sort of gothic edge that feels truly like both a deepening of a lot of the richness of Melancholy, but also like it's a complete sort of sidestep as well. You have these synthetic elements that are layered in so heavily. You have synthesizers and electronic processing. So yeah, it's a really unique record. I think it's always kind of been the little ugly forgotten youngest child in that sort of 90s run, and it was the point at which kind of people were kind of turning their noses up at this band and kind of like having had enough of Billy Corgan's shit. But
can't blame them.
I think what's doubly impressive about it is how well it holds together for an album that's essentially made in the throes of this band collapsing. Like Jimmy Chamberlain had left the band, I'm pretty sure, before this record was recorded.
He had and does not play on a door.
Yeah, exactly. So you have this album that in some respects is kind of synthetic as a neat sort of like advancement or unexpected left turn for the Smashing Pumpkins sound, but also kind of out of necessity as well. Yeah, it's just a really interesting record. It would make for a really interesting record club someday, potentially.
Oh, wow. What a coincidence, Ryley. If only somebody put it on the docket for record club.
Shit. Of course you did. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Very good. Very good.
If only every good Smashing Pumpkins album didn't cost $1,000 to own on vinyl. That would be great if you could make that not the case, guys.
Yeah.
Cool. Last thing I will mention in listening to lots of metal shit right after I listened to Bathory and Cult of Luna, I had the hankering for something specific that would fulfill a kind of like the sort of atmospheric metal vibe that the previous two records have been giving me. So I finished it off with the best record of the three of them, Ashes Against the Grain by Agalloch. Which I mean, like, if you haven't put together that this podcast really likes Agalloch by this point, you're not paying very close attention. Good goddamn, that album has just some of the best riffs ever. I mean, Limbs is just one of the best metal album openers of all time. The 3-part ending of Our Fortress is Burning is one of the best endings to a metal album ever. And you know, the middle parts are you know, they are almost better. I think that's just my favorite project from the band, just because of the way it sounds, which is I know kind of a strange thing to say. I mean, all the records sound great, but like just the way those guitar tones, just like on something like Limbs, they just kind of reverberate and they just sort of become their own soundscape, and then they build on top of those riffs, and just structurally it's immaculate. Oh god, it's one of the best sounding metal albums ever made. And it's like when I listen to that, it's like I feel cold, like I feel the story and characters being described in these songs, like I feel the frostbitten winter just absolutely swallowing me. It's fucking rad. So
I mean it's only my favorite metal album of all time.
I mean, you might
it's only my number 6 ranked favorite album of all time. I mean, fuck.
I like how a lot of that album is like, it's played pretty like simplistically, but not like to the detriment. Like it's not like super technical or anything. It just has this atmosphere that's unlike anything you've ever really heard.
It has this elemental quality that makes it like really, it leaves an impression on you because it's so easily recalled and remembered.
Mm-hmm. Well, like it's an incredibly atmospheric record, but the thing that really like makes it great is the fact that every track has like memorable melodies, not even like multiple memorable melodies. Like you can listen to this album once or twice and you will be able to take away from these dense, like lengthy pieces of music, you will be able to remember parts of it that have just really stick inside of you. And I think each Agalloch album has its own kind of like mood and like sort of tonal palette that it evokes. I think of them very sort of seasonally. Like a lot of people characterize Eggerlock albums as cold, and I think I understand that. I think Ashes is definitely the coldest one. Like Ashes is the winter album. I feel like Pale Folklore and The Mantle have a much more kind of autumnal, even kind of summery feel. If George R.R. Martin hadn't already taken it, I would have suggested the title A Song of Ice and Fire for this album, because that's that's exactly what it evokes.
The only first listen I did this week was inspired by last week's record club. It was Talk Spirit of Eden. Yeah, that's good. That's good album. Sounds
pretty solid.
Sounds like God.
It's like one of the few albums where you can just be like listening to like a part that's just total silence, and you're just being like, this bangs.
Yeah. Like, my God.
Shit.
Throw this shit on the whip.
Yeah, and then like the first half of this record was like fucking spectral, like floating through the fucking, astral library, to bring it back to last week. And then the second half of this record is, oh, I'm sad now.
Yeah, like that first three songs that were released as one song initially. Like, there are no superlatives.
Yeah, it's weird. It's weird, and kind of like I get why that the streaming has split them up. Like on the original vinyl release, like the Rainbow, Eden, and Desire were one kind of continuous piece of music, which if you listen to it, like those songs, the cool thing about it is like, if you don't look at the track running, you can't really ever tell exactly where one of them ends and the next one begins. So it's like such a continuous piece of music, and then streaming split it up. And that's relevant because it's also true of Our Fortress is Burning on the Eggerlock album, where it's like, I have to open up like Audacity and like stitch them together, and so that I can have a single file of those three tracks. Because what the fuck was the fucking point of splitting Fortress is Burning into three different tracks? Like it makes no sense.
Fucking nerds.
Like the first part of it is like the intro, the second part of it is like the meat of the song, the third part of it is like the eerie sort of like feedbacky outro. Like what it doesn't make any sense. Sorry, just this run is just coming up now.
I think it's for Scrabbles. It's like the opposite issue of American Idiot, where they have, I think, Holiday and Boulevard of Broken Dreams as the same
fucking
track.
Annoying.
I'm like, they're clearly separate.
Ashes Against Grain just has an entirely different feel when you realize like not unlike The Waves is the penultimate track, and Our Fortress is Burning is the last track, and like I don't know, it completely changes the way I think about the album in my head. And I hate that it does, because you're right, it's meaningless. These are just track divisions, but this shit matters, man. Like this is just a personal like fucking soapbox of mine. This shit matters. Stop fucking with it. Like fucking Francis the Mute on streaming as well, right? That's the worst example, I think. That's the most egregious one of all.
Did they split up Cassandra Gemini
into like fucking 7 parts or something like that? It might even be more than that. Like there are parts of it that are like 50 seconds. And the worst part of all is that it doesn't clarify that it's like Cassandra Gemini Part 1, Cassandra Gemini Part 2. It doesn't do that at all.
It's just named.
It's just the different parts of the song are just, it's fucking awful. It's so bad. It's legitimately like, it's like, it's as bad as Hitler. Okay. Okay. Never mind. I was wrong about, slightly wrong in that they are all named Cassandra Gemini, but still, like
I was slightly wrong about that. It's not as bad as Hitler.
It's about
Francis
like it's as bad as like
Hitler.
It's as bad as like I don't know, fucking Idi Amin. I don't know, but like it's the Francis the Mute is not a 12-track album. Like,
stop.
I just want to point out that Connor just said Francis the Mute is worse than Hitler, and I was like, "Is this Pitchfork in 2005? What's happening?"
Look. I have been listening to a shit ton of music this week, actually, and a big part of it is that something unexpected happened that has kind of like weirdly had an effect on my week that I wasn't anticipating, which is that I had a hit tweet.
Tweet, guys.
It wasn't like huge. Like it's got like 1,700 likes. It's not like, that's not like viral. It's just like it did well within music Twitter. And I think one of the reasons why it did well is that like it was
which apparently includes Frodo Baggins.
Yeah, I mean, without context, that's amazing. But yeah, so I think it did well because
Frodo Swaggins.
It did well because it was a very niche tweet that gave people who have this same niche interest as me an excuse to come out of the woodwork, because it's not something that's talked about very often. And that, of course, is 90s electronic music and the 2000s electronic music and IDM in specific. I did a meme where it was like, which Eminem are you? And they all like each Eminem listened to a different kind of style or variant of 90s electronic music. And that tweet did really, really well. And like, which I'm glad it did, because I actually spent like about half an hour like preparing it and like selecting the albums and trying to figure out like the logic to it. So I'm really pleased it did well. But the point of this whole discussion, other than just like humble bragging, is that I've been listening to a lot of electronic music this week. And I've been listening to and revisiting and checking out new albums that were either in my meme or related to it. And it's been a really exciting week for experiencing music. So I'll dig into some of that stuff first. One record I want to shout out is the second newest, I think, album that I put in this meme, which is an album by an artist called Culprate. And the album is called Deliverance. And I bring this album up first because I think this is a record that would actually have a lot of appeal to the people in this podcast right now. It is a really colorful, really vibrant, and really charismatic sort of IDM is almost a misleading label. It's got kind of new jazzy sort of like synthetic-y like elements to it. It's really sharp. It's really fun. It's really funky. It has a lot of appeal. It is very highly rated on Rate Your Music, but it also has only about 800 ratings, which is a small number for that website. So it kind of deserves a bit more of a stronger audience. I think there's people here who will probably love it even more than me. Really entertaining, really enjoyable IDM record that I highly recommend. Two other records I'll shout out in this vein. One is a late 90s kind of buried electronic staple called If You're Into It, I'm Out of It, by an artist called Christophe de Babylon. Now, this record and this artist was heavily influential on musicians like Tom York, cited this record and this artist as a core influence. It's the only album that this artist made. And it has points where it's like straight dark ambient for like 15 minutes. It has points where it's like jungle music, breakcore. It gets really, really fucking heavy and intense at certain points. It's an incredibly expressive and morose and moody and kind of, if that Culprate album Deliverance that I just shouted out is like one of the most colorful things I've heard all week. This is by far the kind of darkest and moodiest and most monotone and sort of in that vibe, but it's a really, really good album. I highly, highly recommend it if you want something a little more on the eerie side of electronic music, but without kind of losing the pulse of some of the best late 90s music in this vein. Last sort of IDM record I will shout out is a record that is also on my meme from a beloved and esteemed artist in the electronic music sphere of the last 20 years called Clark. And his album Body Riddle, which I think will have a lot of appeal to fans of artists like Fortet and Square Pusher. Really fun, really funky sort of new jazz, glitchy IDM. It's a really tight record. It's only 42 minutes long. It will never drag or lose your attention. There's a lot of really great drum programming, really great synth work. Actually, I think Aphex Twin fans will find a lot to enjoy here as well. Clark is just a guy who has just been really kind of plugging at it for the last sort of 20 years, consistently releasing really, really strong material and just kind of getting overlooked, I think, because nothing's ever really kind of had risen out of this particular niche that he exists in. But he's a really, really talented electronic producer and artist. And I highly, highly recommend Body Riddle. It's definitely the best record I've heard from him. And like that Culprate album, it's a really easy, really colorful, and really fun and melodic listen. So again, that's my IDM recommendations if you are looking for music in that vein. Other listens I've done this week that I want to shout out. So when Jake recommended the newest album from the legendary sort of alt rock band Failure. Last month, I listened to their new album, said I enjoyed it. Then I'm going back to listen to some of their older records. Yes, I'm going to get to Fantastic Planet. Don't worry about that. But I wanted to first listen to the record they did immediately before it. And now I'm called Magnified, which is equally highly rated on Rate Your Music. And I honestly really, really enjoyed this. In fact, I would say I borderline loved it. It is exactly what I was expecting this band to sound like in 1994 based off of their new record. It has that kind of grungy flavor to it, except that it's much more it's much less kind of aggressive and much more kind of textural and playful. Reminded me of another band I love, Afghan Wigs as well. You can see how both of these bands came out of the same sort of scene.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, really, really great record. It has a giant stone frog on the cover, which is incredibly disarming.
It looks like the fucking Who Dat Boy meme.
Yeah. But
I knew you were gonna say that. That's what happened the last time, because I mentioned the Boris album.
Holy shit!
And we're reviewing Boris today.
But it's
oh my god,
it's a great record. And the best song on it is called Frogs, so the frog gets a pass. But yeah, really, really good album. I look forward to finally hearing Fantastic Planet next. I also will shout out that the late Warren Zevon, who passed away, I think almost coming up on 20 years ago, I think it would have been his 75th birthday this week. I think it was one of his birthdays anyway. And so there were tributes that came through on Twitter for Warren, one of the greatest, funniest, sharpest songwriters of his time, notably also an artist that August is diving deep into the discography of as we speak. And so I wanted to go back and give a full listen to a record that I actually hadn't heard in full before. I'd heard certain songs from it, but I'd never actually listened to the whole thing. And that's his self-titled album. I think when people think of Warren Zevon, they think of Excitable Boy, which has got so many of his biggest songs on it. But the self-titled record, which came out just before that one, is arguably just as good as that record. And it has... I mean, we talk about Warren Zevon as this kind of irreverent, funny, sort of like, I don't give a fuck figure. We also talk about him as this kind of tragic figure who was in the throes of addiction for much of his life and who died terribly young because of, in many ways, how much he had poisoned himself over the years. But one thing we don't really talk about enough is what a beautiful songwriter he actually is. And I mean beautiful. Like in the same sense as someone like John Prine or Dylan or whoever. This man had a knack for writing incredible songs. And I think nowhere is there a better showcase for that than on his self-titled record, which you can hear how hard he worked on these songs. You can hear the refinement in them. There is a bleakness to a lot of this music, but there's also a really sharp wit to it as well. It's never an album that gets lost in its own sort of bleakness. I mean, there's a song on it called I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, and it's exactly as depressing but also as lighthearted as you would expect it to be. But there's also songs on this record like Muhammad's Radio, The French Inhaler, Hasten Down the Wind, Frank and Jesse James, and the incredible closing track Desperados Under the Eaves, which incidentally is the greatest song Zevon ever wrote. That are just stunning. I mean, if there's, I would say honestly, if there's one record that I mentioned this week that you go and listen to, it's this one, because it's just as great as any of the classic singer-songwriter records from the 70s that are lauded, you know, relentlessly by any given music publication. And yet it still seems that Zevon fell through the cracks for a lot of reasons that aren't really related to the music, because this is as beautifully produced as any singer-songwriter record in the 70s I've ever heard. It sounds gorgeous. It does not sound of its time very much at all, in fact. It's really sharp, it's really great. And I listened to it and then immediately had like a 20-30 minute conversation with August afterwards, because the songs are just so full of richness that all you want to do when you listen to it is just talk about it and unpack it. It's a really awesome record. Somehow, I think Excitable Boy still manages to be even better than it. But I think maybe even more than that, this is a record that is really worth experiencing, because as the self-titled nomenclature might suggest, it feels like the more personal of the two in terms of getting to know Warren as a person through his songwriting. But my favorite thing that I listened to this week, not a first listen, but it might as well be because I hadn't heard this record in full. God, I don't even know how long, many years. And that is Fleetwood Mac's Tusk, which is, I think, my favorite Fleetwood Mac album, which is, I can hear you all saying that's such a Ryley opinion. Yeah, it probably is. And this thing, like front to back as an album, it's not better than Rumors. I mean, Rumors is just like fundamentally this incredibly tight and sharp record that never really misses a step. Tusk is unwieldy and it's scattershot and it's bloated and it's all of these things by design. But to me, it is consistently beautiful. It's consistently shocking. It's consistently impressive. And like, we're all allowed these kind of incredibly messy records that we just unabashedly love, that we turn away rational analysis and we just say, I don't care. It's from front to back. I just love it all. Even though I freely admit there are songs on this that are 7 out of 10, whatever. It's just great. It's a great album from front to back, and I absolutely love it. It does not hurt that it features several of my favorite Fleetwood Mac songs. It does not hurt that it features my favorite Fleetwood Mac song, which is Beautiful Child. And
terrific.
I was a living stereotype when I listened to this week because I put it on, I was drinking wine and I was just kind of brooding, and I decided it's time to listen to Tusk. And there were points where I wept, there were points where I sang along, there were points where I just kind of sat in silence, suspended by the music. And I can't, you have to, there's something spectral about this album. It's also got a really fascinating backstory. For all of these reasons, I have made it a record club because I think it's absolutely the most exciting Fleetwood Mac album to talk about, because obviously Rumors has a huge and famous narrative, but everyone's talked that to death. Tusk, I think, I mean, as well as their kind of swan song record, what's it called? Tango in the Night, which I actually haven't heard, but I'm going to listen to that very soon as well.
Their swan song?
Well, it was
like 5 records after that.
I know, but that was kind of the end of the golden age of Fleetwood Mac, right? Because Lindsay left the band after that for a while, I think, because the production was so hectic and nuts, and they made the next few records without him. Anyway, point being, Tusk, I think, is a record that you kind of do need to be in a certain frame of mind to really click with. I mean, there's inarguably stunning all-timer songs on this album, and plenty of them. But there's also like the little...
If you don't like Sarah, I'll kick your ass.
I mean, who the fuck could not like Sarah? I mean, Jesus Christ. But also like, it's one of those albums like the White Album, or I think even more pointed a comparison is Pavement's Wowie Zowie, which is also my favorite Pavement record, where it's like the band just throw all these ideas onto the album and it's like 70 minutes long and 20 tracks long.
I was going to say they're melancholy, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely, that too. Like, it's in the vein of that kind of record, and when they nail the feel and the flow of it, even if the track quality varies somewhat, it doesn't matter. You're sold, you're in there, you're inhabiting that space. I mean, this is Fleetwood Mac, a soft rock / folk rock band who makes songs on this record that at points I compared to Wire, at points I compared to Devo. Like, there's just every fucking possible shade of this band, and like 6 other shades you never thought this band could do. And the most beautiful part about the whole thing is that like the only reason it exists is because Rumors was a colossal hit. They had hundreds and thousands of dollars thrown at them to make this. They blew 80% of it on cocaine. And
I was gonna say that album had to have been like so many fucking so many lines of coke.
When I say like Fleetwood Mac, a band notorious for their cocaine use, and this is the cocaine album they made. Yeah. Like, that tells you something already. It's like 80% went on cocaine, and then like 10% went on like getting a marching band in for the title track, and it's like, it's nuts. It's a crazy album, and I fucking adore it.
All I'm saying is that my girlfriend's proper debut onto the Jams and Tea podcast needs to be talking about this album with us. Not for nothing.
As many voices as possible. It would only be fitting for the kind of album that we're talking about, where you do have like, yeah, Christine, Stevie, just put whatever you want on this album.
I have seen them in concert.
I mean, you're more qualified than all of us. Yeah. Anyway,
I mean, shut up with that. But yeah, like, oh, I saw Rush before Neil Peart died. Fuck you.
Anyway.
Also, before it was when Christine McVie came back, and before God damn it,
before Lindsay got fired.
Lindsey Buckingham.
Yeah, before Lindsey Buckingham left again.
Yeah,
they were all there.
Well, Morgan's just gonna be mad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that. I'm not saying that I cried like a baby listening to Beautiful Child the other night, but I am saying that I cried like a baby listening to Beautiful Child the other night.
Yeah.
And that's all there is to it. And that's my week. Connor, what have you been listening to recently? It doesn't have to be in the last 7 days. It can be in general, anything you want to shout out that you've been digging of late.
A lot of my listens have been one of two things. I've been kind of playing catch up with 2021 albums. A lot of them because a lot of the times actually this seems to happen every year, is there's just like, I have like 200 albums wish listed for that year, and it's already December. I'm like, shit, man. And then so what happens is like I just pick out like 30 that I'm most eager to check out. Actually, my favorite out of the entire list that I made was the Paranol Asian Glow, and
yeah,
I don't know how to say that last
Sonos
name.
Tonum Conte.
There you go, what Ryley said. And that
is that,
but that album is just incredible. Here's the thing, I loved to see the next part of the dream, but let me say, if Paranol's next album sounds like his tracks on this, it's automatic album of the year, no question. Because Colors, I mean, I think I can safely say now that Colors is my favorite song of 2021. It's just
my favorite of his too.
Just like from the moment those guitars come in, da 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 da, and then the whole like ambient interlude, and then it just comes back in with the piano. Oh man, this is like rocking out and crying at the same time. It's just it's like it actually sounds like the peak of music to me.
Listening to Paranol is like being thrown inside an industrial freezer and then taken out and then like just smashed into like glass shards by a mallet.
Yes. Oh, shout out to my good friend Ryan of the channel Not Real Music. He put me on to this. I asked him where he found this, and he was like, I don't even remember, but it's a jazz album from last year called Where Will the River Flow by Matt Carmichael. And what it is like a post-bop styled jazz album, but the melodies that he uses are very reminiscent of Scottish folk music. Honestly, one of the most beautiful jazz albums I've heard in a long time. It's very melodic. There's not really much in the way of like dissonance and crazy chord progressions that you would find normally in jazz, but the playing is just spectacular. The way the piano and the saxophone play so many like Scottish folk, like speedy melodies, like in sync. It's beautiful. I will say the other thing, other than 2021 albums that I've been doing is, and I don't know what caused this, but I've been really getting into a lot of metalcore recently. And I'm already a huge fan of Converge. I love Dillinger Escape Plan. I love Botch, but like those three bands I almost consider like the holy trinity of metalcore. Like they're like the three big ones, especially if you go on Rate Your Music, go to the charts, look at best metalcore albums of all time. it's like Converge.
The Converge discography. Just all
basically.
of
them. And then there's Dillinger, and then there's Botch, and then there's more Converge. So, which is cool. But I wanted to like check out some stuff that wasn't as
Deep
popular.
cuts.
And yeah. One that really captured my attention was Jasmine's Lullaby by Seven Angels, Seven Plagues, which if you look at the album cover, it's like straight up just a jazz album cover. Like you look at this and if it wasn't for the name and the band name, you'd be like, oh, this is a jazz record. But it's one of the heaviest, just dirtiest, most technical metalcore albums I probably ever heard. It's from 2001 too, the year of Jane Doe. Again, I only listened to it once, and it's pretty short. It's like 37 minutes, but man, like what a first impression. Just and some incredible like melodic passages towards the end of a lot of songs, including the last track, which is actually just all piano, and it's really beautiful. So yeah, that's a great record. I listened to from a band called Rorschach, and the album's called Protestant. It's from the year 1993. It's one of the early they're considered one of the pioneers of metalcore. When I looked at streaming, there's actually, when you look up the album, there's like two different versions. There's like the original on like an Autopsy compilation, I think is what it's called.
Oh.
And then there's another one that's like their first two albums in one, but it's like remastered. I listened to the remastered one because the original one is a little quiet and a little dated sounding, but the remastered one, it straight up sounds like Converge. Like I was shocked. And this is from 93, and I'm pretty sure they're actually one of Kurt Ballou's favorite bands. Yeah, it's crazy fast. You can definitely hear how like a lot of metalcore actually came from thrash metal. There's just a lot of like thrashy moments, screeched vocals. Yeah, it's awesome. The last thing I'll shout out is another metalcore album from 2002. It's The Satellite Years by the band Hope's Fall. What's unique about this, I've been a huge fan of this record for a long time, but like it's been hitting even more recently to the point where I'm like, could this get the 10? Could this get the 10? Possibly. What's cool about this band is that they are metalcore with like elements of post-hardcore and again a lot of clean vocals in it, but the instrumentals have this incredible atmosphere to them, especially with like the clean guitar work on a song like Decoys Like Curves, which is just one of the best songs just ever. It's a little hard to describe off the top of my head, but when I first listened to it, I was like, this is kind of like if Hum was a metalcore band. And coincidentally, and I learned this later, the singer of Hum produced this record. And I was like, no way.
I swear to you, man, like all this shit is, all these bands are connected. Like if something
metalcore is just 5 dudes.
And 4 of them are Kurt Ballou.
I mean, the founder of Death Wish is Jacob Bannon. So once again,
yeah, him too.
Yeah,
that motherfucker's the type of person who he was secretly all of the other people. Also, like you just take off the Scooby-Doo mask and it's fucking Jacob Bannon.
Converge are just like they're the star at the center of the metalcore solar system, right? Like it's
definitely.
But every band is orbiting them in some way, and every so often either Kurt or Jacob will have some kind of like involvement in something that expands beyond that scene, like the most recent Armed album, for instance. So yeah, you never know.
Or is it?
Yeah, and when people say like, I don't know, Converge is Mu core, Converge is RYM core or whatever, it's like they are actually the most important band in the whole genre, like without a doubt.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, they're so ubiquitous. It's like, I mean, yeah, in the same way that like fucking Pink Floyd is. I mean,
exactly.
Okay, with that, let's move into the first main review of the day, which is, of course, as was stated at the top of this video, Foxtails are a Connecticut-based post-hardcore / Screamo band. I want to say that they're kind of one of the newest in this sort of wave of millennial / Zoomer, more forms of sort of extreme music. But they're actually not that new. They've been around a while. This is their 4th record, I believe. Notable aspect of this band contains 2 non-binary members. It is a queer band through and through. There are socially conscious and culturally conscious themes that are present on this particular record. And what is most fascinating about it is the particular brand of hardcore music that this band play, with the addition of the band's newest member, Jared Schmidt, who is a violinist who plays heavily on this album. And his particular string work and the way that it interacts with, provides counterpoint to, and gives atmosphere surrounding the hardcore playing on this album is a very, very kind of key part of what makes this record sound so distinct. And this seems to be kind of a breakthrough moment for the band, even though they've been plugging away for a while now, because they're starting to really pick up steam with this record. It's getting them a lot of attention. And off the bat, I'll say, I believe deservingly so. I think this is one of the year's first great albums, not just, a very good record, but a great one. It's a record that breathes a new kind of life into the particular niches that it occupies. It's a record that offers something fresh in terms of subject matter for its genre, but also a kind of kinetic energy from its performers, and in particular, its front person, Megan Cadena Fernandez, whose vocal performances on this record range from full-throated screaming to some incredibly tuneful and melancholic singing. Their performances across this album, on every single track, bar the one track that of course is an instrumental, are consistently captivating and electric, and at points downright skin-crawling. So it's fair to say that if you're partial at all to any bands or any kind of music that fits into the post-hardcore / screamo niche, then this should absolutely be on your radar. And if that's a niche of music that you are not really all that familiar with, then the kind of buffet of the strings, the kind of additional textures that you get within this band, may well make this a good gateway record for you to get into that kind of side of extreme music. But before I get ahead of myself, I'd love to hear from you guys. I want to say off the bat, this record was actually recommended to me specifically, or recommended to us specifically, by our longtime viewer, Brett, who I'm sure is watching right now. Really one of our most interactive viewers and one of our most valued viewers as well. He DM'd me a while ago and said, you have to check out this album, Fawn, by this band Foxtails. I think this was about 2 weeks ago. And he said, that's great. I really enjoyed it. And I got back to him very quickly about it. But I was like, I'm not sure if we'll have the room to cover it. And I think having that amount of time to really sit with it, it became clear quite quickly. And when you guys heard the album too, and were able to kind of co-sign that this is something that we shouldn't miss, because this band is really onto something. They're really onto something unique. You can definitely sort of hear the limitations of the fact that this is just a 4-piece band working on a low budget, but they're doing so much with what they have, and they are clearly really filled with a particular talent and skill and energy that translates to some of the most compelling hardcore music of the last few years.
I don't know if anyone else here has heard the album 3, which seems to be their most popular before this record. It's just guitar, bass, drums, and vocals. No violin here, but the songwriting skills you could see were still on 3, and it's a really passionate, really well performed record. I love the vocals. Both of these records have great screaming and some great singing too. But I guess my one single, again, just based on one listen of 3, my only complaint of it was that some of the songs felt a little bit drawn out for me, even though they go through a lot of changes. I just wish they were kind of a little bit focused more. This record, I think, fixes that issue. So far, this is my favorite album of the year. I really love the blend here with the chamber inspiration, mainly with the violin. It kind of reminds me of a shout out to a legendary Omaha band, Cursive, where they were a classic like post-hardcore emo group. But then with their iconic album, The Ugly Organ, they added a cello just to the instrumentation and just expanded their sound greatly. And that's what this record does. Just adding a single violin, which on first listen, I kind of thought of this as like a Screamo band collaborating with string instruments. But then I realized, no, they just have one violin player doing all this.
Jared Schmidt. Yeah,
shout out Jared Schmidt.
Again, as I said, he is essentially omnipresent when you're listening to this record. There's very few moments where he isn't featuring and doing some absolutely absurd shit with his instrument, and it completely adds this like entirely new dimension to the music. Like, I imagine if you were to strip it away, like, you would have a completely different experience listening to this. He's so in sync with his bandmates, particularly guitarist John Benham. Their guitar work, incidentally, is excellent the entire way through. Some really kind of abrasive and intense and fantastic riffs. There's like this great moment, for instance, in the song Star-Crossed early in the record, where in the second half of that track, it just kind of becomes this sort of start-stop breakdown where you just are getting hammered and hammered over and over again. And there's this real sort of agility to the both the guitar work, but also, of course, the drumming as well. Shout out drummer Michael LaRocca. Just a real sense of synergy in this band. You can tell, obviously, they've been playing together for a while. But what really impressed me was learning that Jared, the violinist, had just joined the band, like very recently, in time for the recording of this record. The way he slots into what this band do is so seamless. And yet he's doing enough to like show his own kind of personality as a musician as well. Like, he's not just accompanying the band. It's really, really great stuff.
Yeah, and one last thing, I'll pass it on to someone else, but I just want to point out, Ryley, what you said earlier about like how you could see people who are not even really into the style of music digging this. I think that this album not only functions as kind of a one-of-a-kind Screamo record, like it very much kind of carves out its own niche in terms of the vocals and the addition of the violin and just the way that they write as well and the way that they play. I could definitely see someone who's not into Screamo, especially like given that Screamo is a genre that's filled with like bands like Jerome's Dream, which is just full throttle on the attack. And that stuff can be kind of overwhelming, but I feel like this is more accessible for people who might want to get into this particular niche alongside bands like Touche Amore.
I haven't heard a lot of bands or albums that sound or belong to this genre like this. So admittedly, I might be a little bit out of my depth here, but that said, I mean, I guess that just proves Connor's point, really, because I mean, I really, really enjoyed this. The two sort of most present elements on here that I think make it stand out are the aforementioned the lead singer and the introduction, of the string instrument, which, I mean, like, for me, the vocals are my favorite part here, just because they are equally expressive and really, really dynamic. Like, sometimes they're like kind of attack on different levels of volume and intensity, even though they're always like powerful. They're always like really prominently in the mix. And there's like a desperation in them that is almost like there's a ferocity here that is kind of like, it took a little bit of an adjustment period, but not because it was like hard to get into, but because it's like, it's so intense and so fiery and so like pointed that it's just kind of like, whoa, like they are shrill. They're like, and also really like androgynous sounding, and it lands a really unique tonality to all of the performances on every single track here. Like, never, like, they don't wear thin, they don't feel particularly like one note or anything. It's just like, this is exactly the type of, the screamed vocals that would appeal to anyone who would like something like Touche Amore, just because it's both accessible in the sense that like you can hear it very presently in all of the songs. Like you can like make it out. It's not like difficult to hear over all of it. But that says, like, it's not to diminish any of the instrumental power here, which there's some really, really solid technical work from everybody here. The work with the violin is excellent. And in fact, my one broad complaint with the album is that semi-frequently is that the violin feels a little muted in the mixes, and it's such an instrumental highlight, and it's a thing that makes this band and album sound so unique and so cool that I wanted that to be maybe a little bit higher, maybe a little bit like more present, but I also can see why that would be very, very difficult, as like it's a very textural addition, and not wanting to have it sort of overpower the really solid meat and potatoes riffs and kit work here, which is all, again, just as dynamic and cool as the rest of it. Point being, it's communicated with a specific intensity that feels both unique and really, really honest. It's like, this is an album that is 100% pure catharsis. Like, it has these sort of melodies that are like, it actually reminds me a lot of Stage 4 in that the melodies on it are really, really tight and really, really catchy on some of these songs. So you can sort of imagine yourself, it's just like, man, if I could like get the lyrics down, Pat, I would be screaming along to this shit, and I would be like sitting afterwards in a state of absolute euphoria of just like, wow, I got to fucking exercise all of that shit out of me. And I can only hope that it does the same thing for the lead singer, because it sure as fuck sounds like it does.
I very much enjoyed this project. The only hesitancy I have with it is the mix itself, similar to what Jake was talking about, particularly with the way that the strings interact with everything else. And I basically boil that down to mixing a record like this being a science that is not quite yet figured out. And that's perfectly understandable considering how relatively ambitious this album is. I've never heard anything quite like it. I'm certainly very excited to see what this band thinks up next. In the arms of
the angel. There's an art to really good screaming, I think. And Jake, you've kind of touched on this in terms of how expressive and dynamic the central vocal performances from Megan Cadena Fernandez are. Their voice is commanding, powerful, but also, as you say at certain points, like genuinely shrill and full of desperation and aching. Like aching, I think, is a really good way of describing the general feel of this record.
Definitely.
And on that note, I want to dig a little bit into the subject matter of this album, something that we haven't really sort of touched on. A big insight here that I gained in terms of understanding this record, because for the most part, the lyrics are kind of the sort of abstract poetry that seems reasonably typical of this kind of music, I think. Little that's kind of quite concrete, little sort of in terms of general conventionally structured storytelling, and more kind of abstract poetry that evokes, you know, scenes and feelings and experiences that are, you know, generally quite unpleasant. And in the Bandcamp description for this album, there are a number of definitions of the title of this album, Fawn, and in particular how that word and what it represents can relate to the experience of suffering from and recovering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Particularly in the wake of experiencing abuse, which may either be interpersonal or may be kind of systemic. And I think this record draws together the effects of abuse on both the interpersonal and the kind of macro social level quite strongly. But they define what it means to fawn as a verb, like to act in service, to flatter, to attempt to appease some person or some force that has some kind of power over you, or whose appeasement is important to you in some way. And they have this extensive passage from Pete Walker's book on complex post-traumatic stress disorder about how this manifests in people who are dependent in some way on someone else, both in terms of toddlers and young children, and in terms of grown adults, and how these instincts and inherent motivations on a behavioral level can be taken advantage of in the context of an abusive relationship, and then drawing that even further into the ways in which governments and systems and general organizations and constructions of capitalism utilize these psychological tools on a fundamental level to subjugate people. And that point is where I think it's relevant to bring back something that I mentioned at the start of this segment, which is that this is a band that contains multiple queer members. Their front person is a person of color as well. And these aspects of the band's cultural makeup are important because this is also an aspect that the band highlight in their Bandcamp description, in the sense of dedicating this record to, and I'll just read the dedication. Thank you endlessly to our queer siblings, our black and brown siblings, and all of our immensely talented friends in the scene who have fueled us with the inspiration, love, understanding, and drive needed to persevere despite the bullshit life in America throws at us all. And so there is this deeply rooted and powerful sense of this strong desire for justice, and the strong desire to overcome suffering, and the strong desire to examine with a lens how dependence is used as a tool to keep people down and to subjugate particular groups. And again, I bring this up because, as you will have realized if you've spent any time looking at any of these lyrics, they're pretty abstract poetically. It's not necessarily clear or immediately easy to draw out any kind of specific interpretation, but there's a lot of power in them. And I think that they're incredibly well written and deserving of a shout out. I think that one thing we've also mentioned is the variety in vocal performances from front person Megan. And you have these, of course, the majority of the record is dominated by those full-throated screams that we've mentioned, but also they have these gorgeously smooth tones that they use on tracks like Catalyst as well, which is a song I want to highlight because I think it's one of the most exemplary on the record in terms of how great this is musically, but also what this sort of lyrical theme that I've brought up. You have these lyrical passages in the song that evoke this idea of dependence in really devastating ways. Transfixed, held captive, I submit. Will this allow the haze to lift? I'll never speak again, and nothing makes sense, and I can't seem to take it. Refusing comfort in chokeholds. Violent conflicts tear apart the psyche. Tell me what to do. Tell me what I've done. Tell me how far I've come. I mean, sitting down and to really like give this a full attentive listen with the lyrics in front of me, it was difficult because you are immersed in this state of dependence in ways that are really tough. In fact, I was reminded a lot, the reference point that came up for me thematically in terms of this lyrical style and in terms of the specific subject matter of songs like Catalyst, was Lingua Ignota's Caligula. I thought of that a lot while listening to this. And in songs like Catalyst, Megan has this, obviously, this full-throated scream, as we mentioned many times, that does evoke a similar sense of kind of paralyzing fear and despondence and suffering that Kristen Hayter evokes on Caligula with her own particular scream and use of it. And that's like, there's this kind of profoundness to some of this lyricism and the way that it's delivered that for me goes a lot deeper than some of the recent records that I've heard coming out of the hardcore scene. I mean, to me, the hardcore scene, if anything, has kind of been getting a little bit more irreverent as of late with bands like The Armed, for instance, whereas here you have a fully hardcore band through and through who are not afraid of being like fully immersed in some of the most difficult subject matter that I think any band of the genre has really like attempted to tackle, in terms of the scope of it and in terms of the just the sheer fucking intensity of the way that they go about it. And those are my kind of scattered thoughts. I mean, what do you guys think about like the way this record makes you feel and what that band are trying to do with it?
I mean, it's kind of punk rock, you know, that kind of spirit is like I'm glad that you pointed that out. Really, honestly, I'm just going to co-sign the last 2 points you made, is that really, if there's any time to take advantage of the fact that you can use extreme genres to speak to something really poignant and really deeply felt and widely felt by a lot of people, this is the opportunity to get to like move past genre barriers and just have people who are in a lot of pain or people who are subjugated by these systems connect with music in a way that maybe they haven't before, to explore new avenues of art that they maybe didn't previously understand or connect with or were even aware of, and then explore a part of it that speaks to something that maybe didn't really have the opportunity to click with them before. So it kind of like, I'm glad that this is catching on like it is. So I hope other people, you know, like I liked the Armed album and everything, but like, you know, by all means, take advantage and be emotionally poignant right now, because we need that. A lot of people need that, especially people like, you know, the queer community, the, you know, people of color. That's, I mean, God, I don't even need to say anything about that. And also just the Caligula comparison. I can't believe I didn't make that. That's yes, brilliant. I couldn't have said it better myself. Absolutely the exact same vibe, in that you listen to it and you're like, maybe I should sit down after this.
Personally, I haven't really gotten the chance to like deep dive into every line and every lyric, but like even when you just glance at the lyrics or listen to what she's saying, which it's just really like poignant and powerful and really poetically written. One particular thing that caught my attention was the intro track, Ego Death, which like the last part of it, they say, is this what it's like to grow up, to realize everything's fucked up, to realize dreams are delusions of youth, no room for missteps, easily caught in spider webs, wisdom feels worthless when compared to innocence, yet faith is embedded and infinite, the beauty of life is ubiquitous, the soul dies when all it can do is reminisce. And that's just like, that's some powerful shit right there.
Yeah,
it's the reference to spiders, but there's several points on this album where they kind of get a little mathy with the riffs, and I was kind of reminded of the Dismemberment Plan at points.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
I was just
you can see a lineage there.
Yeah.
So this kind of combination of these themes of dependence, but also this other theme that kind of gives a little bit of a conflict with that, which is the theme of not belonging as well. And I think this relates to the fact that, you know, these are lyrics written very powerfully from the perspective of, you know, someone who is occupying groups that are consistently marginalized in the culture in which they live. And so to me, one of the most interesting things about what this record is doing, you know, subject matter wise, is the way in which it's not only interrogating, you know, dependence on systems, dependence on people, but primarily on systems, but also the way in which you're set up to fail within this dependence, because you are also set up to feel as though you don't belong in the system that you are dependent on. And so you have a system that's creating a dependence while at the exact same time telling you that you aren't worthy of the dependence. Like there's in La Belle Indifference, Megan says at one point, I'm uprooted, I don't belong. And there's multiple references across the record that evoke that feeling. And so that's, to me, one of the most heartbreaking, but also one of the most politically pointed aspects of this album. One of the things that I think makes this band so kind of, I hate using words like important to describe a band, but genuinely like gives this a vitality in terms of like the cultural space that it occupies, because it's not only showing, you know, representation on a, you know, cool two-dimensional level in which it's awesome, but also it's asking difficult questions, and it is doing things under the surface that are actually important and are actually, you know, real signs that the genre, the scene, the, you know, the musical world is evolving, is kind of catching up with, you know, the way things are changing dramatically socially all around us. That's a lot of heavy stuff. The one other thing I wanted to mention that I'm sure you'll all agree with me on is this record is structured immaculately, in the sense that it kind of accumulates this boiling sort of intensity that slowly kind of increases as it goes along. Like for the most part, the first half of this record is kind of these kind of short, sharp bursts of energy, but also have some of the record's most atmospheric moments too. And you get a sense of like the band sort of warming up, and because they'll kind of like recede and then they'll attack and then they'll kind of recede. For example, like the 2 tracks in a row of Gazelle and Barbecue are like really fiery and really intense, and some of my favorite songs on the first half of this record. But then you get Gallons of Spiders and So It Goes, which are more kind of like peeling back, taking away from that. And also the record does this early on too with Ego Death, which is really in your face, and then Star-Crossed, which has a lot of dynamic variety in it. Like there are parts of that song that are softer, there are parts of that song that are more intense. So what the record does is it kind of sets it up in this kind of attack and withdraw way, where you're kind of like not exactly sure what's going to happen next, and you're a little bit disoriented. I may be feeling a little bit like the way that the characters, the person that is the subject of these songs may be feeling. And then by the time you get to the last stretch of the record, the last 5 songs in particular, you're just fucking thrown in the deep end. Like the band are just absolutely just catastrophically playing, to be honest. Like especially when it comes to those last 2 tracks, the last 3 tracks really. But like what I love about this record is that it kind of revs the fucking engine, and it'll fucking hit the pedal, and then it will kind of withdraw again, and then by the time you get to the final stretch of the record, it's just fucking mowing over you, to the point where I think the record actually climaxes with its best moment. The final track here, Paper Tiger, which is my favorite thing on this record, absolutely fiery, intense. It brings together all of these thematic subjects that I've been talking about in lyrics like attempting to reason, what a waste of time. As far as you're concerned, I'm doing fine. Tend to stagger from catastrophe to catastrophe. Keep my mouth shut. Got the 3rd degree. Magnetic fixations, disintegration of your creation. Is this how you like me? Confused by reality, always at your mercy. Then it's how I'll remain, so well behaved, digging 2 graves. I know we're the same. The pain is ingrained, courses through our veins. So we go through cycles, death grips on survival, keeping our eyes closed, shared ruminations, shared devastations, all lost in translation. And they go on and on and on. And you get the final, it boils and boils and goes harder and harder and harder until the very last moment of this record. And I love albums that do this, right? I love albums that just fucking keep getting more until the last moment when it just fucking goes fucking beast mode. And the last part of this record, like the last line of this album, we talked about Megan's vocal range as a screamer, right? How incredibly talented they are, how much, underappreciated aspects of good screaming that they absolutely master. And they deploy their skill masterfully, because in the very last line of this album, suddenly they find a new level, and it's like genuinely blood curdling when they're screaming, "Save your pity, I am playing for keeps." Which, that is a hard as fuck line in and of itself, but especially combined with the way they deliver it. Genuinely, like it feels like the bowels of hell open up and a fucking demon is fucking howling through it. And legitimately, I got chills listening to it this morning. It's such, again, it's mastery of their vocal instrument, and its mastery of construction, both of a song, of an album. Like everything comes together so beautifully on this record. And the more close attention I've given it, the more thought I've given it, the more listens I've given it, the better and more well crafted I realize that it is. And the more I realize that, this is a genuinely great band who have made a titanic work that will undoubtedly be on many year-end lists. And yeah, I love this thing.
Yeah, I love it too, obviously. Going back to kind of what you were saying about like the themes about, like queer identity and, being a person of color in this like scene, which I'm not the best person to speak about on this, but it's just worth noting that this is from a particular scene and style that is kind of dominated by the, straight white head male. So when you get bands like this and other bands like Soul Glow, who's getting a lot of attention recently,
yeah,
it's
we're
really
very
like
excited to review their new album, by the way, which I think
Yeah.
is coming out in March.
Yeah, I need to check them out too, because they seem really good. But it's just like, and that's not to discredit a lot of the classic Screamo bands that are mostly, straight white males or whatever.
No, of course not.
But what I think makes a record like this fascinating is that it comes from a completely like different perspective than any of those classic records. And I think this band and again, Soul Glow, among others, are really kind of like expanding a lot of the emotional range of what Screamo can be and what they can talk about lyrically and stuff.
Yeah, and I the reason I went like so into it on that is that I mean, obviously it's easy to say this is an important band because diversity and these really kind of like cheap ways of like saying, hey, this band is cool because we're like hip and all that sort of stuff and we want, but it's so much more than just the fact that this band includes, persons of color and queer people. That stuff's awesome, but like actually listen to what they're saying and what they're trying to do, and because that's where like the true beauty of this band and their success is. And it's just a really exciting time for hardcore music when bands like this not only are making great music that we can listen to and go, hey, it's great, but are actually like getting attention and making waves. That's where the real juice is. The fact that we are essentially bandwagoning on this because we're late to the party. It came out a couple of weeks ago. A lot of people have already gotten to it before us, but that's awesome. That's a great thing in this case because it means that, we don't have to feel like, as queer internet people with a very small following, we don't have to feel like it's our responsibility. We get to just sort of just cheerlead and watch as this band kind of blows everyone away, which is just so awesome.
Yeah, and queer internet people with a very small following. New Twitter account bio just dropped.
Yeah. Yeah, like that. I will say also that they are like expressing a lot of the same emotion that all those classic Screamo bands, and a lot of like the old school, like most classic Screamo bands actually came to mind when I was listening to this. In particular, the song Star-Crossed, like towards the middle, when a lot of these songs start off really soft and kind of eerie and haunting, but then they pick up the pace. And Star-Crossed in particular reminded me of the first track off of actually my favorite Screamo album, which is Gospels, The Moon is a Dead World. Like
sick
where that bass,
comp. I love that album. That's a sick comp. I didn't think of it, but now you say that, I'm like, shit, yeah. That's a really good comp. I want to go and listen to that after this now.
Yeah, it's kind of similarly like progressive in a way. And I mean like progressive in the musical sense where there's a lot of changing structure that flows really dynamically. And another band that came to mind was one of my other favorite bands in this style is Off Minor, where they have a lot of interplay between crunchy sounding guitar and bass, and there's just having those two. I mean, the violin, great and all, of course, but like just having those two and what they're doing with each other, like, it's something special. And I guess the last two things I'll say, like, especially regarding the music, is the guitars here sound really, really good. They're like they're crunchy, but they're not like saturated to the point where it sounds like metal or something, but they're played with such an intensity that when you get to like Ryley said earlier, the very end of the record with Paper Tiger, where the guitar actually does become distorted and loud, it absolutely crushes you. And also I didn't mention, and I forgot their name, but the drummer on this album is so good. Like there's so many incredible moments.
His name's Michael LaRocca. Yeah, he's great.
Shout out. I don't remember which song exactly, but there was a moment where the drums just like like there's a building section, and the drums are like carrying this whole buildup all the way through, not just getting louder, but playing more and just going absolutely ape shit. And it just sounds fantastic. And the blast beat moments too on this record, I love those too.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a good point to wrap up on this particular record. Let's go into our favorite tracks and ratings. Jake, why don't you kick us off?
My 3 favorite tracks are probably Tact Nervios, Gazelle, and Per Tiger. Least favorite track is probably So It Goes. That said, it is a very good instrumental. I don't want to it's not bad. And I'm gonna give this an out of 10. I would say this is the first must listen of 2022, honestly. And I would not the fact that this could easily grow on me, and you might even see it on an end of the year list of mine, potentially. I mean, this is just an album with a density that can't properly be appreciated within just 1 week.
3 favorites: La Belle in Défense, Paper Tiger, and Star-Crossed. And overall, I will give this a 7 out of 10.
My 3 favorite tracks on the album are Star-Crossed, Catalyst, and Paper Tiger. Least favorite track is probably Gallons of Spiders Went Flying Through the Stratosphere. And I'm going to give this record an 8. I, again, co-sign what Jake said. I think this is the first great album of the year.
So my 3 favorite tracks, I think, would be Paper Tiger, Star-Crossed, and I'm gonna go with Gazelle. And I'm gonna give I'm gonna give this an 8.5.
Nice. That brings the average to 7.9 for Foxtails' Fawn. All right, let's move on to the next review of our episode, which is longtime pod viewers may remember, and in the early days of Jams and Tea, we actually reviewed the last Boris studio record, which was titled No. Actually, I don't think that was technically the last Boris studio record, because they did a collaborative record with Merzbow, which is also great, by the way. Incredible, worth checking out. Don't be put off by the Merzbow feature. It's not like harsh noise or anything. It's a very, very good album. But their last kind of studio record just as Boris was 2020's No, which still holds up to this day. I think Jake and I both went back and revisited that this week, and both of us heartily co-sign what we had to say in that early review. In fact, I'm sure we'll each get
one of my favorite albums of that year.
Yeah, and I think relevant to bring up in relation to this new record, because Boris, as anyone who's listened to more than just 1 or 2 Boris records will know, Boris are a pretty diverse band in terms of sound. They initially kind of came into prominence with their particular brand of noisy sort of drone music that incorporated sort of guitar feedback and textures and more sort of languorous sort of styles of music in juxtaposition to, when they wanted to, quite assaultively loud and abrasive punk-edged stuff also. And they've kind of flirted between these 2 extremes and into the weeds of more experimental forms of music in the interim as well. I mean, they're a band that have been around for like 25 years now. And so W is an interesting, so this is why I'm hesitant to call it a left turn, because Boris have such a dense discography. I could never hope to listen to everything that they've done. But for all I know, they've experimented with the kind of music on this record before. But certainly I haven't heard them make music that is as still and eerie and haunting as this particular album is. It forms a sharp contrast with No, which if you go back and listen to it, that was like crust punky, aggressive, noise rocky, like balls to the wall for the most part.
Metal too.
Doomy, yeah, absolutely. Whereas this is kind of like we theorized in that episode that maybe it was the first half of like a split double album because of the title, which suggested like, is it going to be Boris's Yes next? But also the fact that that album ended with an interlude, which is very strange for an album to do. And so we thought maybe they're doing this thing where we're going to get this double record in two halves. And W, as I'm going to continue to call it, both reaffirms and kind of entirely contradicts this notion, because it can be seen as a kind of contrasting version of, again, these two extremes of Boris's sound that I've talked about. And also the fact that if you put the two titles together, you get Boris Now, which almost suggests like these two records together are giving you a picture of what Boris is now at this point in their 25-year career.
The final track on No and the first track on W contain a similar lyrical passage, I think, that connects the two of them.
Okay. Well, there we go. So there is, I think, a good amount of evidence to suggest that these two records are kind of companions to each other or related in some way. But of course, the opposition to that is they couldn't sound any less like each other. This album is kind of like the ethereal, spectral after image of the songs on No. It's like, if you take the negative space, if you suppress all of the heft and intensity of that record and you just take the kind of like room sound underneath these heavy recordings and you kind of boost that and you make it the songs, you get an album like this, which is understated, has understandably left a lot of fans and general listeners underwhelmed, but which I think, when taken on its own terms and when you really allow it to kind of when you really allow yourself to kind of be immersed in it, has some of its own kind of unique pleasures and sonic templates and textures and sounds that I think are worthy of mention. What do you guys think?
As the biggest fan of No, I think this is a weird thing to tackle just because, you know, there's no like, despite the fact that there is evidence to connect the two records, again, there's nothing like outright, like the band didn't make like a statement or anything saying like, oh, this is the second half of a double album, even though I would argue that this does in fact work as if I can make a really podcast core reference here, this works as the damnation to No's deliverance, so to speak. That said, as good as No is, I think you can definitely label that album as being a bit monotone, I think I would call it. It excels in that monotone nature. It fleshes out its monotony very, very well. And it's paced in such a way that doesn't really matter. It kind of builds you up with these really doomy dirges and then a bunch of crust punky bangers. And then, you know, it's done. That's the appeal of the album. It's fucking fantastic. I love it. So naturally, when you invert something like this, you're going to do something very, very different sounding. And what we have here is a bunch of really interesting experiments, a lot of really great singular ideas, and a lot of songs that I really gravitate towards. Unfortunately, this is a project that I would deem to be the total sum is kind of the lesser than the sum of its parts, I would say, is that I enjoy a lot of singular moments on here. There are a lot of really great points where the band do something like, I'm sure that they've experimented with stuff like this before in the past just because of the kind of band that Boris are. That said, if you asked me back when we reviewed No, if they would have made a song like the incredibly spectral, ethereal, and icy Isolina, I would have been baffled, because this sounds like, when I listened to this, I was just like, this sounds like Björk's Vespertine. What the fuck? Like, I was just kind of blown away by the fact that they were going for this like really moody soundscape. And in a way, it's like, yeah, this is a perfect contrast to what No was doing. That was a direct sort of like smack in the face. And this is a genuine world building exercise that the band is frequently incredibly good at. I think the opener, I Want to Go to the Side Where You Can Touch, which builds from the lyrical theme of the final track of No, where the whispered vocals say "you can touch" over and over again. Really, really creepy. Kind of like that one track on No is sort of the one precedent that this album does have, is that does sort of like serve as a transitional moment, that interlude. And it sort of extends to songs like Drowning in Numbers, which are a little bit more aggressive. But there's nothing here that's like outright what you would expect from somebody like Boris. There's nothing on here like Pink or Amplifier Worship or No. There's one
track that I think has like some of their earlier energy, and which is the Fallen, which has like some of the loudest kind of like guitar feedback, and it kind of builds in intensity too. But even then, it's almost weird. Like on this album, in this context, the most intense and loud song feels like a reprieve from like the main focus of the record. It's quite strange how that functions here.
It's a little bit more easy to grasp and grab onto, and it leaves me in a very strange place with this record, in that simultaneously, like, I understand being underwhelmed by this, and in many respects I am underwhelmed by it, and yet when I'm listening to it, I just really kind of forget about that, and I really enjoy it. But simultaneously, it's not ever an experience that really congeals. Even the songs on here that sound kind of similar to one another, they don't really feel like they're of it piece. They don't really feel like they coalesce into something that's as, I guess, as cohesive as something like this probably should be. It's just, there's a distinct lack of focus here that I feel like if they had tried to go along like the lines of like making tracks like Isolina and Drowning in Numbers, which I think are pretty head and shoulders the two best tracks on here, they had focused more specifically on that sort of atmospheric, almost post-rocky dirginess, then we might have something here. But there are too many points where the record just kind of breaks itself up for the sake of variety, where I'm kind of like, I wish this was more monotone, because the strength of this album, I find, is I listened to this as a double album with No, and that's when I think the album is best enjoyed. I think it's a significantly stronger effort, because when you combine the two, it's a more holistic experience. It's also not particularly long. I think both albums are on the shorter side of 40 minutes. So it's really not that much, and No is really well paced. So it just, you fly by, and then you kind of remain in the stasis of this sort of icy record.
So my thoughts are actually very similar to Jake's. When I first listened to this, my impression was, well, that was an album. That was definitely an album of music that I just heard. But then I actually, when I listened to it for the first time, I wasn't that focused on it. I was kind of more background, and that's kind of what a lot of this album does. It almost functions like ambient background kind of stuff. But when I focused on it the second time around, I was like, oh, this is a cool album. Like, I actually love the first track on this thing.
Yeah, it's great.
I love how huge those ambient pads are. And like the panned vocals that are like intertwined with each other is really cool.
Production's immaculate.
Oh yeah. Like that's something that I think is Boris's specialty, is just sounding absolutely massive no matter what they're doing. And like walls of distorted feedback on this track, I also thought were cool. It's a really cool track. The only thing that I don't like about it is the very ending, where it kind of just goes into this, like, if I remember right, like a short little instrumental.
It has like a kind of false ending. Yeah, I know what you mean. It's kind of a bit like, okay, yeah, I'm with you there.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes into probably my main issue with this album. Actually, there's two. A lot of the transitions here are just kind of spontaneous and just
very abrupt.
Like a lot of these songs, like you mentioned, Isolina sounds, even a track like Old Projector, which I'm not a huge fan of either, but I like the sound play that's going on at the very least.
Yeah.
It just, like, everything just kind of stops and then something else starts. There was another track, I think it was Oh yeah, the Fallen, yeah, the one that is a really cool track with loud guitars and the first real like drone metal track on this album. But again, it just ends abruptly and it kind of leaves me hanging. Like I'm listening to this and I'm getting lost in what they're doing pretty well because that's what they do best. But then there's not really any transitions from that. And maybe it's because like maybe I'm just used to albums like Feedbacker or Flood where those albums specifically are treated as like one whole piece that flow into each other perfectly. So
I think when you listen to a Boris record, you can kind of get the sense that they're a band that like jam. And when they get in the studio, they jam and then they figure it out from there, which is not to denigrate their process at all. Like a lot of
great bands, that's why they're great, honestly.
Exactly. And a lot of great bands work through that method. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe I am wrong, but I do get a really strong sense that Boris are a band that get in the studio, they jam, and then they kind of piece it together afterwards. And while I definitely concede that the complaint about how sort of stark some of the kind of cuts and bits can be is a genuine real complaint, I will say it doesn't really bug me that much. Or at least like it's not something that leaps out at me as something I need to comment on with regard to this record. I actually have come to really appreciate this album. I think it's quite good. And I think that there's actually more satisfying to its structure than maybe, or at least from where I'm sitting, than maybe kind of has been said yet. Like, for instance, it has this fantastic string of 3 songs at the start. Jake, you've spoken beautifully about Isolina, which is the most kind of beautiful thing here, has this beautiful kind of tranquility and comfort to it, but also these like little bits of like hi-hat clipping drum sounds that are like reversed to give this kind of like sense of kind of unease that is just really subtle. And I love it. Like there's a lot of studio stuff happening on this ostensible minimalist drone song that I really, really appreciate. And the lead single for this record, Drowning by Numbers, I absolutely love. Like it's this properly eerie and sludgy and drony kind of almost sort of post-punky, vibey, weirdo track. It has these genuinely unsettling vocals that sound like demonic, and it has this great sort of like muscly bass part that is kind of start-stoppy, but also like gives the track a really unique flavor, and I love it. I've listened to that track a lot just on its own since it came out. And then the rest of the record kind of gets a little bit more patchwork, but I actually think it's the forays into louder sounds in tracks 5 through 7 are well balanced by the fact that the record kind of concludes with this climactic track, You Will Know, which feels like to me it brings together the minimalist aspect of song construction and some of these more louder distortion-based, feedback-based aspects of tonality really nicely. Like it feels like elements of songs like Isolina and the opening track, and elements of songs like The Fallen, for instance, are actually kind of weaved together really nicely on You Will Know. And I also want to shout out a song no one's mentioned yet, but also a really strong standout from this album, Beyond Good and Evil, which is just a really concise piece of music. Again, pretty but eerie and unsettling in a way that Boris are really, really good at doing. You can tell that there are seasoned musicians who have been together for a really, really long time and kind of know how each other works, and they speak to each other in this language of music that you feel you might get some understanding of if you really kind of like dive into the weeds of the weirder aspects of their music. But I'll co-sign what Jake said as well. I do think this record plays better when viewed as a kind of accompanying sort of companion record to No. It's a strange experience listening to those 2 albums back to front, as you could well imagine, from just how vastly different they are. But yet there is a shared DNA that I think underpins them and makes that a fascinating experience, listening to these 2 records back to back. But yeah, no, I enjoyed this record. It is a record of subtle pleasures that won't be for everyone. It has a ceiling because of its nature in terms of like overall quality. but I don't think that should necessarily be held against it and with too much denigration. It is the kind of record that doesn't really get enough appreciation, because in the age where, you know, music has to be delivering these immediate hits in order to be like, to stay with you or get a positive review, we as listeners in the streaming era, when we can listen to whatever we want, whenever we want, we can just listen. We're not as likely to, and we're not as prepped and equipped to appreciate from the off a record like this, which works in patience, which is kind of demanding. And so I am glad in the end that we ended up reviewing this. And I have Jake to thank, really, because initially when I heard it, I was like, yeah, whatever, just like Connor. But no, I was persuaded to spend more time with it. And now I'm like the Burial EP that we've talked about just about in every episode this year without actually reviewing. You know, it's demanding.
Jake's ambient arc.
It requires patience, right? It's not, this and the Burial EP are not projects that are made for the era where we want instant hits from music, where we want instant hits of dopamine. These are records that are like, they want you to form a little relationship with them. They want to get to know you. They want you to get to know them. Or at least that's how the bands or artists in question are designing them. And so that's what I would say to people is remember that in a time where like we're moving fast through everything that we experience, all the art we experience, it's good to remember that sometimes you got to slow down. And W is as good an album to show that to the listener than any.
Also give a shot of listening to it alongside No, because in my opinion, the project benefits from this overall. Like I would, if I would rate it slightly higher if I combined the two as like a whole listen. Like that is the relationship forming for me. It's like that's an experience that I really think is quite worthwhile.
Truly, this is Boris's In Your Honor.
I wish Morgan was here.
Oh, yeah. That took me a second. I just realized what you're referencing.
Morgan would be like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could have said that one Panopticon record that's like split into the two halves, the quiet half and the loud half, but I thought that Foo Fighters was a funnier reference.
No, it's definitely funnier.
Anyway, favorite tracks and ratings for Boris is... Let's go reverse order. Connor, why don't you kick us off?
All right, so my three favorite tracks are I Want to Go to the Side Where You Can Touch, ... Then I go with The Fallen and Beyond Good and Evil. My least favorite is the last track, if that counts. I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10.
My favorite tracks are the first three. My least favorite track is Old Projector. Album gets a 6 from me. Morgan, who had to leave, has passed on his thoughts that he's basically in agreement with.
He's passed on.
Yeah, he's passed. Yeah. Yep, he's passed it. And he said that he found it to be an interesting experiment that he enjoyed listening to, and he gives it a 6 out of 10 also. So I think Boris would enjoy the fact that they've gotten 3 successive 6s now. Jake, what is your favorite tracks and rating?
Gotta go with Isolina is definitely my favorite. Drowning in Numbers, and also say Beyond Good and Evil. I like that song quite a bit. Least favorite, it's either Yozon or Old Projector. And I give it a 6.5. Right. I'd give it a 7 if I combined it with No, but
that's good to know. So that gives us an average of 6.1 for Boris's W. Let us know at home, what do you think of either of the albums that we have discussed today? Did you agree with us? Did you disagree with us? Do you have a different perspective that you want to add on either the Foxtails record or the Boris record? We want to hear from you. We want you to check out these records too. If you haven't already, hopefully you have. You probably have if you're watching by this point. But anyway, regardless, if you enjoy the video, please hit the like button. Really helps us out, even though it's such a small thing. If you aren't already subscribed to the channel and you enjoy what we do, subscribe, because we post 3 videos every week and we cover a variety of things, and not just in the world of music. If you want to go above and beyond and you want to support us, then for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button and become part of the Jams and Tea family. And what this entails is you get your name shouted out at the beginning of every video that gets posted on this channel, as well as getting priority comment responses and more. You get to be essentially one of our best friends, which is awesome. I would do that.
Look, I'm
lonely.
I'm not saying that most of the supporters have been on the show by now, but they have. So
and
you never know.
Those that haven't, we're gonna make it happen eventually. But yeah, as always, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Dollar Shave Club, shave time, shave money.